Good evening and welcome to Oscar Live, proudly brought to you by the Old Scotch Collegians Association. My name is Scott Montgomery, Oscar's Executive Director. Tonight's conversation, Scotch in Times of Adversity, will be brought to you by the School Chairman, the Honourable Dr. David Kemp, and from the class of 1959, and the Oscar President, James Douglas, from the class of 84. A conversation between two great men and who are passionate about their school. I'd like them to now take their seats. Thank you.
Evening, James.
Good evening, David, and thank you, Scott, for that. Really appreciate that. I think we're certainly passionate about the school and at least one great man, that's for sure. So welcome, David, and thank you for taking the time to speak to the school community tonight.
Oh, thank you very much for asking me, James. I appreciate that.
It's terrific. So tonight, as Scott mentioned, we're going to talk about Scotch in the time of adversity and particularly some of the history and sort of cultural attributes of the school. But I thought maybe start on a bit of a lighter note. So how are you and Anne-Marie been coping with lockdown? And do you have some thoughts about your perspectives on how it's affected the broader community?
Anne-Marie and I have had a fairly quiet time during the lockdown. Our family are spread, and so we've had the house mainly to ourselves. We've concentrated therefore on our food and our television programs, and I've done a bit of writing, which has actually been helped by the fact that I've been uninterrupted. It's made me realise a bit that a lot of time is spent in travel, and during this time of lockdown, it's nice actually to be able to focus for quite a long period of time on matters that I'm writing about and the history of the country and so forth.
So that's terrific to hear. I'm glad because it sounds like at least Anne-Marie is also still talking to you, which is a big positive.
She is. We've missed our newest grandson, but Anne-Marie insists that we get video pictures of him every evening, and so we've enjoyed those. And we feel quite close to all of our family who are communicating, but not face to face.
Yeah, well, I think you're not alone there. I think a lot of us are dealing with distance and isolation at the moment. So one of the good news is this week, though, is that at least part of the school is back to school this week. We've got year 11 and 12 and some of the junior school boys back in the school, which is terrific. I mean, give me some thoughts, though, on what you've really missed as chair of the school over the past couple of months of this lockdown period around the school.
Well, I think I've had a feeling of loss at all the events that would have occurred that didn't occur, and that I would have attended that I didn't. And there's a sense there, I think, that we've all missed a lot, I think, as a community. But what's been so inspiring in this period is the way in which the school's teachers have put in a tremendous effort to make sure that the boys continue with their education. And the parents have really shown a great sense of responsibility and commitment to education by having the boys at home and yet supervising their work and communicating with teachers. I have to say, as chairman of the council, I've been tremendously impressed with the way in which the council members via Zoom have worked very collegially and cooperatively to make sure that Scotch gets through this crisis in the best possible way, and that the school's parent body and the wider school community are properly considered in all the decisions that we take. And we have considered the school's values very closely, and we've tried to act as a council, I believe, in accordance with those values. You're a member of that council, yeah. and you know really how we have considered what this school stands for, what kind of school it is, how a school council ought to respond to its community. And I think I've certainly learnt a lot from the way Tom Batty views the school. It might be interesting just to say a couple of things about the way in which the school community is seen by us.
So I'd like to do that. Can I hold that thought, though? Because I want to come back to that and explore a few other things first. But let me first do a shameless plug for Oscar, right? So I think we've all missed the fact that events haven't been able to happen. The annual dinner was meant to be tomorrow night. That's now been turned into a digital event, which I encourage everyone to tune into. But obviously, as we come out of this lockdown period, those events, the reunions, the branch events, the other kinds of gatherings we've had as a school community will be back on again. So I'm excited about that. So let me turn to sort of the really key thing that I wanted to touch on tonight. So as many people in our Scotch community know, David has had an illustrious career as a federal politician, including a long period as a minister and member of cabinet. And in fact, his brother also was a politician as well. And so you might sort of think about David being a politician as participating in the family business. But I think that's not really fair in the sense that you're obviously very passionate about history, particularly Scottish history and the history of Scotch College and the things it's been through. And I think it's fair to say, really, I characterise you now as more a historian than a politician. And so I wanted to touch a little bit on that as you think about sitting here in this memorial hall as we are, which is such an important part of our history. It's been here for more than 100 years now. We obviously just before lockdown celebrated the fact of the laying of the foundation stone by Sir John Monash. I wonder if you can just reflect for a moment on the value of thinking about history and what we might learn from it as we think about our response to current events.
Well, I think as a school, our history provides us with a very strong identity. And I think the identity of Scotch has been tremendously important in the way it's responded as a school and as a community to a whole variety of crises that have occurred during the time that this school's been in existence. The First World War obviously was the time of adversity that gave rise to this particular building. And of course, it remembers all those who died in the First World War and later in the Second World War, over 500 Scotch boys who were really fighting for values like liberty and democracy and their families and faith, truth, the love of their community, the sense of personal responsibility for what happened to the world. I think those sort of values reflected the foundation of the school by James Forbes 169 years ago.
So talk to me a bit about that, right? So a lot of people, we know the name James Forbes, but talk a little bit about that person and how he was shaped by the Scottish Enlightenment and then coming to Australia and establishing the school.
Well, I think we're very fortunate in our founder. James Forbes was a really quite remarkable young man. He came out here to Australia and to Melbourne when he was in his 20s. He was a leader very quickly in the Melbourne community. He was, although a Presbyterian minister and wanting to train young men in the community in the Presbyterian religion, he nevertheless was very non-sectarian. He had great relations with all the religious groups. He cared very deeply about the Aboriginal people. Here, he was very interested in protecting them from some of the violence that was going on in the community. He helped establish institutions like the Royal Melbourne Hospital, Mechanics Institutes. He founded other schools before he founded Scotch. So he brought with him these values that he had a sense of responsibility for building a better world. And that's what he came out here to do. And as we know, tragically, he died quite young. In fact, he died in 1851, only months before the school actually opened its doors. But by then he'd set up its finances. He'd organised the first principal and he'd set it going with what you've referred to as the values of the Enlightenment. He believed in faith and science. He wanted all those who attended the school to have a general education so that they understood the world. That Scotch wasn't about just communicating knowledge, it was about communicating values and principles and morality. And the first 4 headmasters of this school were all born in Scotland. And so some of them were educated at the same university as James Forbes, Aberdeen University. They were graduates of King's College there. And so there was a great unity of purpose in the early decades of Scotch College, and that carried right through, in fact, until the 1940s, when we had our 4th headmaster, Colin Gilray, also born in Scotland, but came to here via New Zealand. So it was a great purpose and direction that the school had been given by James Forbes. And I believe that that has continued to provide the foundation of values that Scotch exhibits today, and the attitudes to its community, to its staff, to the boys who come to the school. They're all based on those values.
So let's talk about that, right? So I agree with you. Nearly 170 years of history, there must be something, right? But if we just talk about it again, we're sitting in the memorial hall that represents the sort of post-World War One. In that 170 years of Scotch's history, there's been a lot of difficult times for the school and the broader community. Think about World War One, World War Two, obviously, but also the influenza pandemic after World War One. There was a polio epidemic in 1938. Can you reflect a bit on the community's responses to some of those difficult periods, the Scotch community's responses?
Yes, well, of course, Monash is the figure we associated with the First World War, and he was a great Scotch community person. He worked with Scotch boys in the course of his military life, but when he came back, he became president of the Old Scotch Collegians. He laid, as you said, the foundation stone for this building, and he really valued what Scotch offered him in terms of membership with that wider community. He was a member of the Jewish community, and of course Scotch has had strong relations with that community right through, and the Zelman Cowan building of course reflects that. The pandemic of 1919 caused the school to stay closed for a month before it opened. Scotch on the whole was apparently not greatly affected, although many of the old boys who'd been injured in the war, who had what we now call in this COVID crisis comorbidities, suffered badly from the influenza. Some young old boys died as a result, but on the whole the school wasn't greatly affected in health terms, and in fact in 1919 the Geelong Grammar crew had to withdraw from the head of the river. I don't think that was the reason Scotch won, but Scotch won that quite handsomely because it wasn't affected by the influenza crisis. The polio crisis was very serious for young people. They were most susceptible to it. And in 1938, the junior school closed for a period and the younger boarders moved off campus. When they came back, they moved into McMecken House, which became a young boarder's house until about 1965. So it was, it had a lasting effect, but Scotch community rallied to that, and when the Salk vaccine became available, Scotch boys were right at the forefront of getting vaccinated. So that was a really good outcome of that crisis. In the current pandemic, I think what we've seen is a remarkable coming together of the Scotch community. Although social isolation has been the order of the day, I think what we've experienced is a tremendous desire to reach out to people in the technological ways that are now available to us. And there's been a lot of exchange of information, trying to keep relationships going, certainly keeping teaching going. But if I could say this, I think if we get through this as well as I believe we are going to, it will be because of the level of cooperation and support that the Scotch community members have given to each other. It's also made us value face-to-face relationships.
I agree. Even if we're 1.5 metres apart.
Even if we're 1.5 metres apart.
So just while we're touching on that, so coming back to a point you started to talk about earlier, which is how that sort of spirit of community and the original thinking that underpinned the establishment of the school, how that informed the school council and particularly the school's leaders, yourself and Tom's, response to the current crisis in terms of the steps the school's taken.
Well, one of the things we were most concerned about at the council is to recognise the way in which the COVID-19 was affecting all the members of the Scotch community. And I think we clearly realised that some families were suffering very badly from it for reasons perhaps of loss of employment. There would be many families who were finding that the relationships made it difficult, or the home situation made it difficult to give their boys the educational setting that they needed to keep going as well with their education as they could. So we tried to take all those things into account. And one of the things that Scotch has done is to focus its financial aid on those families that need it most. And I'm pleased to say now that well over 100 families have approached the school, and the school has been able to offer financial aid in one way or another to those families. And what I like about that, from the Scotch community's point of view, the Scotch family point of view, is that we've tried to recognise that the relationship that Scotch has to its community is not just a transactional relationships. It's not just based on the financial purchase of education, nor is it a legal relationship. It's a relationship that depends on those people who contribute to Scotch being members of a larger community. And I think we've succeeded in that. And I think judging by the reactions of parents and the feedback we've had, I think parents have recognised that the school has gone out of its way and the teachers have gone out of their way to make sure that the school can continue to provide good education to the boys. But I'm sure the parents and the teachers are both delighted that the boys are now returning.
Yes, I must say, particularly for those parents of younger students, I know plenty of my colleagues that are sick and tired of teaching their 7-year-olds to read around the kitchen table while trying to do work at the same time, which raises an interesting point. So we're on a Zoom conference right now. I'm doing Zoom calls all day long. I've seen my son doing his classes on Zoom. This sort of move to a digital technology, a digital base for our learning has been quite dramatic, right? We've talked about it for a long time. What do you think, as you look forward from here and think about how education might change, and obviously with a background as an education minister, how you think some of those changes that we've seen, what will stay, what might not stay, or what's temporary, how does education evolve from this?
Well, I think we'll learn a lot from this experience, and I think digital learning will become a very significant part of the way in which education goes forward. But having said that, I think the bigger lesson is the importance of face-to-face. And in many ways that's quite surprising, because there's been a lot of discussion in the education world about online universities, for example, and online schooling replacing face-to-face and campus schooling. And yet here we've had an experience now where we've seen exactly what remote learning can deliver and what it can't deliver. And I think what we've found is really what our principal, Tom Batty, has been saying ever since he's been principal, which is that you need face-to-face conversations and relationships to underlie all good education. And that's what Scotch offers. And of course, as you know, that's what the new buildings of Scotch are offering. They're redesigned, as it were, from the old classroom-style school buildings to enable those relationships between boys and their teachers, and between the boys themselves, to grow and strengthen, because that's, and again, if I can borrow a phrase from our principal, that's how interests turn into passions. When boys can pursue these dreams that they have and the ideas that they have. I think Scotch has become very good at that. And while I think it has been extremely good at remote learning, Scotch flowers and shows its full potential when boys are actually here and in those relationships. And I believe that the boys who've missed out in that face-to-face world for some time now will really embrace it when they come back to school, as they're now doing this week.
Yes, I never thought my 16-year-old would be keen to come back to school. It's interesting you say that about face-to-face too. So one of the big sort of epiphany moments almost for me about education has been, Scotch provides a level of learning, right? There's a curriculum that the students learn. But what I've found is that in actual fact, the purpose of a school is actually much more than just learning a specific curriculum. There's, as you talked about, the moral history and the sort of cultures and values that you develop, and building your character as a student. And I think when you reflect upon that face-to-face piece, that to me is critical to part of what a school has to do.
I think so, and the participation not just in the classroom with the teacher, but in the co-curricular activities on the sporting field, all those relationships of being a member of a team and leading a team, they're all tremendously important in the development of what I like to think is the Scotch boy. And of course, one of the interesting discussions we have at the school is there such a thing as the Scotch boy? And does the Scotch boy today have a close resemblance to the Scotch boy of, let's say, 50 years ago? And of course, we all know the differences.
Yeah.
The culture of the country changes and boys' attitude changes, the language changes. But there are continuities in the character of the boys that go through Scotch. And those continuities are that they do have a sense of personal moral responsibility and self-discipline. We see this every year in the Parelberg Award presentation night, which is given to boys who've really given something to their community and thereby put into action the spirit of the school. And we see that in the school's relationship with the Tiwi Islands. We see it with Chitulika and Kapunthi over the years in Africa, and Chapaka now. There are many ways in which this school reaches out to the community. Could I just perhaps give one of the memories that I have about this hall,
Of course.
which illustrate this? In 2018, on presentation night, the prizes were given by a man called Greg Munar, who is an elder in the Wadaya community in the Northern Territory, which is a very deprived community in many ways. It has a lot of difficulties. And Greg and his dance team, of which a member was a Scotch boy who'd come from the Northern Territory, stood here in his dance clothes and paint with an academic gown on and handed the prizes to the year 12 boys that year. Now, to me, that was an extraordinary moment in Scotch's history, because it was the 50, 60,000 years of Indigenous history in Australia meeting up with the Scotch community and its values, and the two coming together to perform the same ceremony. And I think that shows the tremendous importance of this face-to-face world that we live in, and also the sort of memories that this hall encapsulates. I mean, this hall really stands for the values of Scotch. The values are inscribed in the window. They're seen in the faces and figures of the people in the portraits. Behind every name on the boards around this memorial hall, there's someone who has set out in life to work hard, to achieve something, to have aspirations, to contribute to a team or to the intellectual life of the school. And so this hall, in a way, encapsulates in a concrete, physical form the fact that what makes Scotch, I think, a school that does achieve what it sets out to do is the values of that school. That's not to put down what can be done in the online world. And indeed, I can give another illustration of that. On Anzac Day this year, normally as chairman, I'm asked along to the Anzac Day Assembly. There was no Anzac Day Assembly this year. So I complained to the principal about this and said, well, you know, I've missed out on one of these great events. And he said, well, I'll send you a video. So he sent me a video in which he and the chaplain, David Brown, the organ, the school captain, were going through a whole assembly. The hymns were sung, the Bible was read, the prayers were given, and the camera was focused on them. And as I watched that, I realised that hall is empty. No one there. And then the principal told me 1,000 boys were online on that Anzac Day Assembly. And so again, even this hall in its physical space was able to participate in the online world that we've had to put up with for the last few months.
Yes, so it sounds like a much better experience than the AFL football matches played to no crowds. But I do think you raise a great point, though, and I would add to it just two comments. you also miss out on the sort of traditions and cultural things. So for example, the torch ceremony held here for departing Year 12 students. I think that's really important. And the other thing that I think you touched on but didn't mention specifically is part of our values, I think, is that spirit of inclusion. And I think that's really important.
I think that's right. And of course, that also comes out of that Scottish tradition. Robert Burns, of course, is famous for his poetry in general, and certainly he's a great writer of poetry. He would have said verse, but I think we say he wrote poetry. But one of the things he was his most famous poems was the line, particularly, "that a man's a man for all that." And of course, he included all people in that, really.
Yes.
And the brotherhood of man. And I think that's what Scotch has. It's a democratic culture that this school has, and everyone can be a part of it. And everyone can be an equal part of it. And the foundation principle of the school that Tom Batty often talks about is that the dignity of every person is the founding principle on which our education is based. And that comes out of that tradition, and it's strengthened by that tradition and by that knowledge. And it makes Scotch a very inclusive school.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think that sense of the spirit of equality out of the Scottish Enlightenment is important too, and reflected in that poem of Robert Burns. So just then thinking forward a little bit, so Oscar's got a new home opening shortly, together, perhaps more importantly, with the archives and the Scotch Museum. I mean, from my perspective, that's quite exciting, but have you got some observations about the opening of that facility?
Well, I think it's wonderful that Oscar now has its own home, and I think it's going to be a very handsome home. It's going to be a home that will provide Oscar with facilities that it hasn't had before, particularly the meeting room that's going to be there, and its proximity to the archives is, I think, quite significant, because Oscar is really one of the great pillars of Scotch's traditions and what the school stands for. And if you go back over the school's history, and you look at, for example, the Scotch Crest, or the move to Hawthorne, the building of this hall, all these significant moments in the history of the school, Oscar has been there. And it's not only been there, it's actually been an initiating force in the development of Scotch College. And Oscar still keeps reminding the school about this heritage and the values for which this heritage stands and which it symbolises. And so we've got the bagpipes and the pipe band, and we've got the way in which Oscar manages the valedictory. So the whole Scotch community can be involved in that, the parents as well as the old boys and the boys as they leave the school. So the Presbyterian Church, which is part of the tradition that we take out of the Enlightenment, and of course it's older than the Enlightenment. The Presbyterian Church is influenced, perhaps more than it cares to admit, by the equality and egalitarianism of that Enlightenment era. And I think that Oscar and the Presbyterian Church today, as we know, appoint the Scotch Council, and they give the school those values and make sure that the school doesn't lose sight of them. And I think the Scotch Council values that. But I'm so pleased that Oscar is going really from strength to strength. And I'd just like to congratulate you, James, as the president of Oscar, and the presidents of your generation, these younger presidents we've had in recent years, I think have done a tremendous job for Oscar and for Scotch in giving Oscar that very strong sense of its responsibility for the school. And I think the whole of the Scotch Council and I personally have benefited from the work that Oscar's done in that area, and I hope that Oscar will continue to give the leadership to the school and to the old boy community, and to support the school in the way that it's done.
Well, thank you for that. I will shamelessly steal from another poet and say we simply stand on the shoulders of giants and continue a tradition that goes back more than 100 years now. So for a moment now, let me just change again. And the school has seen a lot of changes under your leadership as chair. We've got a lot of new buildings, the new St Andrew's Square and Kean Cohen building that at least the year 11 and 12 boys are now enjoying. The Zelman Cowen Centre for Science. We've got other plans about what's going to happen to the school clearly changes around digital learning, that some of which will stay. If you think forward 10 years from now, what does the school look like? What is different? What can people expect? Perhaps the people that are here now, when they send their children to this school, what will it be like?
Well, I think the school is in a transition period at the moment, and we're seeing really the ending of the form of education that has been offered at Scotch and really all other schools for the previous lifetime of the school. And that is the group in the classroom all receiving the same messages from the teacher. And what we've now got is the ability of the school to increasingly respond to each individual boy. I think in the last great Scott, it was called personalisation of education, which is a term I haven't come across before. But we used to say individualisation, I suppose. But Scotch is now more concerned to make sure that each boy realises what the school has to offer and develops their interests into the passion that will carry them through life. And I'm quite sure that that will continue to be the direction of education. And so when you ask what's the role of digital education in that, we've seen that the digital world is able to offer tremendous opportunities for creativity that perhaps the pre-digital world was not able to do with the very sophisticated programs that it has. But I'm quite sure that what will continue to distinguish Scotch are the face-to-face relationships, and the new buildings that go up will increasingly be aimed at encouraging those relationships to develop in the most fruitful way.
Yeah, I agree. It's interesting. So look, I want to bring it to a close now. I really appreciate your time tonight. But perhaps before we do, you know, a lot of the community has had a pretty difficult couple of months. I know I've had plenty of challenges, not least of which isolation, but other things with work. That's obviously going to continue. We're probably going to see a difficult couple of years. How do you think the environment as it changes will sort of shape the school's response to this ongoing difficulties we're going to have that move from concerns about the pandemic to perhaps broader concerns about the economy?
Well, I'm quite sure you're right that the school community is going to be facing a lot of challenges over the next couple of years. And it's incumbent on the school to continue to understand those, to hear what the community is saying to it about those challenges, and to respond to them in the most appropriate way. As you know, the council has already taken a decision that the school fee will not be raised next year, and we've done that early. It's earlier in the year to make that announcement than in previous years, and the reason we've done that is to give families the chance to plan ahead in a degree of certainty that they wouldn't otherwise have had. And I'm sure the school council and the school executive and the principal are going to continue to be listening to the parents when they bring their boys to school, and to talk with them and to see what the Scotch community really needs to continue to thrive and flourish in what is going to be quite a challenging environment.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Well, David, I'm going to bring it to a close. I really appreciate you taking the time tonight to speak to the school community. I think everyone who's listening tonight would really have appreciated what you've had to say, particularly about how the school's thinking about our response to the current environment. And I think in wrapping it up, thank you to Scott Montgomery and Caroline for setting up tonight, and best wishes and our thoughts and prayers with everyone in the Scotch community. Thank you.
Thank you.